The galaxy was vast, its corners teeming with countless civilizations, each with their own traditions, mysteries, and dangers. Among them was a race so feared, so shrouded in myth and misunderstanding, that even the most adventurous travelers avoided their worlds. They were known as the Dravani, a species whose females were said to be untouchable, not because of physical might, but due to an ancient and deadly curse. For centuries, the stories persisted. Those who got too close to the Dravani females suffered fates so chilling that few dared even to speak of them. And yet, in all the galaxy's vastness, where tales turned into legends, one human decided to do the unthinkable. The Dravani were unlike any other species humanity had encountered. Towering and ethereal, their skin shimmered like liquid silver under the light of their twin suns. Their movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, and their voices carried an unearthly melody. Yet, it wasn't their beauty or elegance that inspired caution. It was the silent, ever-present aura of danger that surrounded them. The males of their species were formidable warriors, but it was the females who held the galaxy's collective breath. Whispers told of visitors who attempted to court them, only to vanish without a trace. Others spoke of fleets that tried to invade Dravani territories, only to crumble before reaching their shores. Fear had become their shield, their reputation enough to keep even the most curious at bay. And yet, there was one human who had always been drawn to the unknown, to the challenges that others avoided. He was an explorer by nature, someone who found meaning in unraveling mysteries. For him, the stories of the Dravani weren't warnings, they were invitations. He had seen countless worlds and met species thought long extinct. The more he learned, the more he realized that fear often came from misunderstanding. The galaxy's most haunting myths often masked truths far more fascinating than terrifying. So when the opportunity arose to visit the Dravani homeworld as part of a diplomatic envoy, he volunteered without hesitation. The journey was daunting. The Dravani world, Viren, was located deep within a sector of space that many charts left blank, as if even mapping their territory was forbidden. The human fleet approached cautiously, their ships dwarfed by the towering obsidian spires of Viren's orbital defenses. There was no need for a show of force. The Dravani had made it clear that any attempt at hostility would be met with swift annihilation. Instead, they arrived as emissaries, bearing gifts and the hope of understanding. When the delegation landed, they were met by an imposing procession of Dravani guards. Their leader, a towering figure with eyes like molten gold, welcomed them with cold formality. Yet, as they were escorted through the glittering halls of Viren's capital, the human explorer couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken lingering in the air. The architecture was breathtaking, with its crystalline towers and cascading light displays, but beneath its beauty lay an air of sorrow, as if the entire planet carried a weight no one dared name. It wasn't long before the delegation was introduced to the Dravani Council, a gathering of their most esteemed leaders. Among them was a female, her presence so striking that even the seasoned diplomats faltered in their words. She was unlike anyone the human explorer had ever seen. Her silver skin glowed faintly, her eyes shimmering with a depth that seemed to hold galaxies within. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried an undeniable power, each word resonating like a chord plucked from an unseen instrument. But what captivated him most was her isolation. While the other council members exchanged glances and murmurs, she stood apart, her gaze fixed on the humans as if seeing them for the first time. There was no hostility in her eyes, no threat, only a quiet curiosity. It was as if she, too, felt the invisible barriers that had kept her kind separate from the rest of the galaxy. And in that moment, the human explorer made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't let fear or myth dictate his actions. He would find a way to connect, to understand what had been hidden for so long. The days that followed were a blur of formalities and negotiations, but the human explorer couldn't shake his fascination with the Dravani female. He noticed the way her gaze lingered on the stars outside the council chambers, as if longing for something beyond Viren's borders. He saw the fleeting moments of hesitation when she spoke, as if carefully choosing her words to avoid revealing too much. And he felt the unspoken tension whenever she entered a room, the way her presence seemed to shift the air. Finally, during a rare moment of reprieve, he found her standing alone on one of Viren's observation platforms. The city stretched out below them, its lights shimmering like a sea of stars. For a moment, he hesitated. Approaching her felt like stepping into the unknown, a leap of faith without a safety net. But the stories that had kept others at bay only strengthened his resolve. If no one else dared, he would. He spoke her name, a sound both beautiful and unpronounceable, and introduced himself, his voice steady but respectful. She turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his intentions. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that felt heavier than words. Then, to his surprise, she responded. Her voice was softer than before, almost hesitant, as if she too was uncertain of what this exchange would bring. Their conversation was brief, tentative. He asked about her world, her people, and she answered with guarded honesty. But when he asked about the myths, about why no one dared to get close, her expression shifted. The warmth in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something colder, more distant. She told him that some truths were better left buried, that the fear that surrounded her kind was a necessary burden. But even as she spoke, there was a tremor in her voice, a crack in the armor that hinted at a deeper truth. Before he could press further, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Dravani guards appeared, their expressions stern as they escorted the human back to the delegation. As he walked away, he felt her gaze lingering on him, a weight that he couldn't ignore. He didn't know what he had uncovered, but he knew he couldn't stop now. There was something here, something that went beyond myths and fear, something that connected their two worlds in ways neither could yet understand. And as the stars above Viren shimmered like 1,000 unspoken truths, he made a silent vow. Whatever the cost, he would uncover the story behind the Dravani's isolation, the secret that had kept their females untouchable for centuries. Because sometimes, the greatest discoveries weren't found in the stars, but in the courage to break through the walls that separated us. The days on Viren passed in a blur of diplomacy and subtle tension. The human delegation moved carefully, each meeting and conversation a delicate dance of words. The Dravani Council was polite, even cooperative, but there was an undeniable distance, an unspoken boundary that none dared cross. The human explorer, however, couldn't stop thinking about the moment on the observation platform. The Dravani female's voice, her hesitation, and the weight of her words lingered in his mind. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something deeper driving him, but he couldn't let it go. Each evening, he would find himself replaying their brief exchange, dissecting her every word and expression. There had been fear in her eyes, yes, but also a glimmer of something else. Sadness, longing. He couldn't quite place it. He began to notice small details during the council meetings. She rarely spoke, but when she did, the room fell silent. Even the other Dravani seemed wary of her, their gazes averted and their postures stiff. She carried an unspoken authority, but it wasn't the kind born of rank or status. It was as though she embodied something the others both revered and feared. One night, unable to sleep, the explorer found himself wandering through the halls of the Dravani Palace. The architecture was as haunting as it was beautiful, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly with energy, casting shifting patterns of light across the floor. He came to a stop before a massive mural that stretched across one of the grand corridors. It depicted a scene unlike any he had seen on Varen, a battlefield under a sky filled with stars. At the center of the chaos stood a figure that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Dravani female. Her silver skin glowed brighter than the others, and her arms were raised as if commanding the very stars themselves. Around her, figures fell to their knees, their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror. He was so engrossed in the mural that he didn't notice her approach until she spoke. Her voice, soft but steady, startled him. She told him that the mural depicted a legend from Dravani history, a tale of their ancestors' first encounter with the greater galaxy. In those days, the Dravani had been conquerors, their power unmatched. The females, she explained, had played a central role in their rise, their connection to the stars granting them abilities that defied explanation. But with that power came fear. The galaxy united against them, and the Dravani were forced to retreat, isolating themselves to preserve what remained. As she spoke, the explorer couldn't help but notice the way her voice wavered, as though the story struck closer to home than she let on. He asked her why the females were still feared, even now, centuries later. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Finally, she admitted that the fear wasn't entirely unfounded. There were truths about her kind that even she struggled to accept. She didn't elaborate, and before he could press further, she turned and walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. The next day, during a rare break in the negotiations, the explorer decided to learn more about Dravani culture. With the help of a translator, he visited the archives, a sprawling library filled with ancient texts and holographic records. The archivists were courteous, but guarded, their expressions unreadable as they provided him access to select materials. Most of the records were dry accounts of trade agreements and political treaties, but one file caught his eye, a collection of personal accounts from early contact with the galaxy. The stories were chilling. They spoke of the Dravani females as something otherworldly, beings who could bend minds and wills with a glance. One account described a meeting with a female diplomat that ended in chaos when an entire delegation turned on each other, their minds seemingly unraveled by unseen forces. Another spoke of a fleet commander who fell into a trance after an encounter with a Dravani female, his ship drifting into a star before anyone could intervene. The recurring theme was clear. Proximity to the females brought madness, destruction, or worse. Yet, as he read, the explorer couldn't shake the feeling that these accounts were missing something. The descriptions of the females didn't match the quiet, thoughtful woman he had spoken to on the observation platform. The fear seemed exaggerated, the details distorted, as if the stories had been shaped more by rumor than reality. He wondered how much of the Dravani's isolation was self-imposed, and how much was the result of centuries of misunderstanding. His suspicions deepened when one of the archivists, an older Dravani male, approached him cautiously as he prepared to leave. The man's voice was barely above a whisper as he warned the explorer to tread carefully. He hinted that the truth about the females was far more complicated than the records suggested, but when pressed, he refused to say more. His parting words were cryptic. Some stories are written to protect, others are written to control. You must decide which this is." The explorer's curiosity burned brighter than ever. That evening, he returned to the observation platform, hoping to find the Dravani female again. When she appeared, he wasted no time. He told her what he had learned about the accounts in the archives and the archivist's warning. Her reaction was subtle but telling. Her shoulders tensed, and her eyes darted to the shadows, as if fearing they were being watched. She didn't deny the stories, but neither did she confirm them. Instead, she asked him why he cared so much, why he was so determined to uncover the truth. He didn't have an easy answer. Perhaps it was his nature as an explorer, or perhaps it was the way she looked at the stars with such longing. He told her that understanding was the first step toward connection, that breaking down the barriers of fear could lead to something greater. She seemed to consider his words carefully, her expression softening for a moment before the tension returned. Finally, she told him that if he truly wanted answers, he would need to see something for himself. She led him to a part of the palace that seemed forgotten. They stopped before a sealed door, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with light. She placed her hand on the door, and it slid open with a low hum. Inside was a chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls shimmered with energy, and at its center stood a pedestal holding a small, glowing orb. She explained that this was a remnant of their ancestors' power, a fragment of the force that had made them feared and revered. As he approached the orb, she warned him that it would show him the truth, but that truth came with a cost. He hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in, but his determination won out. He reached for the orb, his fingers brushing its surface. Instantly, his mind was flooded with images, visions of the Dravani's rise and fall, their triumphs and betrayals. He saw the truth of their power, the burden it placed on the females, and the sacrifices they had made to protect. When the vision ended, he staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. She caught him, her grip surprisingly steady. For the first time, he understood the full extent of what she carried, the isolation she endured, not out of pride, but necessity. And yet, there was still so much he didn't know, so much he needed to understand. As he looked into her eyes, he realized that the real journey was just beginning. The days following the revelation in the hidden chamber were a blur for the explorer. The vision the orb had shown him refused to fade from his mind, playing on an endless loop every time he closed his eyes. He saw the rise of the Dravani females, their abilities unrivaled, and their influence spreading like wildfire across the stars. But he also saw the cost, the fear they inspired, the betrayal they faced, and the heavy burden they bore as a result. What struck him most wasn't the power they wielded, but the profound loneliness that seemed to come with it. The more he reflected on what he'd seen, the more he realized how little the galaxy truly understood them. The Dravani female, who had guided him to the chamber, became an enigma he couldn't unravel. She was both the key to the mystery and a reminder of how complex the truth could be. She spoke little of what he had seen, her responses carefully measured whenever he tried to bring it up. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were filled with a quiet pain, one that echoed the isolation he now understood was woven into the very fabric of her existence. Still, there was something unspoken between them, a connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. As the delegation's visit drew closer to its end, the tension between the humans and the Dravani Council grew palpable. The other delegates, unaware of what the explorer had uncovered, were becoming restless. Negotiations were stalled, and the Dravani leaders remained evasive, their responses steeped in caution. The explorer's unease grew as well. He couldn't shake the feeling that the council was hiding something far more dangerous than the myths surrounding their females. Late one evening, while the palace was cloaked in silence, the explorer found himself drawn back to the observation platform. The stars above Viren were a sight to behold, glittering in an endless expanse of darkness. He barely noticed her approach until she was standing beside him, her presence as steady as the night sky. She told him that the visions he had seen were only part of the truth, a glimpse of a history that had been deliberately buried. When he pressed her for more, she hesitated, her gaze fixed on the stars. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told him that the true danger wasn't the female's power, it was what they had sacrificed to contain it. She explained that the orb he had touched was one of many fragments of a greater force that had once united the Dravani. Their ancestors, realizing the chaos their abilities could unleash, had sealed their power within these orbs, scattering them across Viren to prevent anyone from wielding them unchecked. The females, as the primary conduits of this energy, had become the guardians of the orbs, bound to protect them at all costs. But over time, the burden had grown heavier, the isolation more profound. And now, the balance they had fought so hard to maintain was beginning to unravel. Her words sent a chill down his spine. If what she said was true, then the myths surrounding the Dravani females were more than exaggerated stories, they were a warning. He asked her why she was telling him this, why she trusted him with something that could shake the fragile peace between their species. Her response was simple but haunting, because he was the only one who had dared to see her as more than a myth, to look beyond the fear and find the truth. Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of a Dravani guard, his expression grim. The council had called an emergency session, and the delegation was to attend immediately. The explorer followed reluctantly, his mind racing with questions. The council chamber was a whirlwind of tension when they arrived. The Dravani leaders were engaged in a heated debate, their voices rising and falling in a language that the human translators struggled to keep up with. It didn't take long for the explorer to realize what was happening. One of the orbs had been disturbed, its energy destabilizing, and the consequences could be catastrophic. The council's solution was as drastic as it was final. They proposed sealing off the affected region, abandoning it entirely to prevent the energy from spreading. But the explorer, emboldened by what he had learned, couldn't stay silent. He argued that abandoning the region would only delay the inevitable, that the Dravani needed to confront the problem head-on. His words were met with skepticism and anger, the council unwilling to entertain the idea of exposing themselves to the very force they had spent centuries containing. The Dravani female, however, surprised everyone by stepping forward. She sided with the explorer, her voice calm but resolute as she argued for a different approach. She proposed using the orb's energy to stabilize the region, a dangerous but potentially effective solution. The council was visibly shaken by her suggestion, their fear of the orbs evident in their expressions. But she was unwavering, her determination shining through like a beacon. The explorer realized in that moment that she wasn't just fighting to protect her people, she was fighting to reclaim the connection they had lost, the balance they had sacrificed in their quest for control. The council eventually relented, their decision driven as much by desperation as by her conviction. Preparations began immediately, the palace buzzing with activity as the Dravani and humans worked together to execute the plan. The explorer stayed close to her throughout, offering his support wherever he could. He knew the risks they were taking, the danger they were walking into. But he also knew that this was their chance to rewrite the narrative, to prove that understanding and cooperation could triumph over fear. As the hours passed, the stakes grew higher. The affected region was becoming increasingly unstable, its energy threatening to consume everything in its path. The explorer couldn't ignore the tension in the air, the way the Dravani guards exchanged uneasy glances and the humans whispered nervously among themselves. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange sense of hope. For the first time, they were facing the unknown together, united by a common purpose. The final phase of the plan required them to travel to the heart of the affected region, a place that even the Dravani feared to tread. The journey was fraught with danger, the energy fields around them crackling with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. As they approached the site, the explorer couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to attempt. This was it, the moment that would determine not just the fate of the Dravani, but perhaps the future of their relationship with humanity. The female's presence was a steadying force, her calm resolve a stark contrast to the chaos around them. She explained that she would need to channel the orb's energy directly, a process that carried immense risk. The explorer offered to help, but she shook her head, her expression soft but firm. This was her burden to bear, she told him, but his presence gave her strength. Her words left him both humbled and determined. If he couldn't take her place, he would do everything in his power to support her. As they stood at the edge of the swirling maelstrom, the explorer felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was the culmination of everything they had endured, every risk they had taken. The energy around them surged, the air vibrating with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The Dravani female stepped forward, the orb in her hands glowing brighter with each passing second. The explorer watched her, his heart pounding as the tension reached its breaking point. The orb in her hands burned with a light so intense it painted the swirling chaos in blinding shades of silver and gold. The Dravani female stood resolute, her face calm despite the storm of energy threatening to engulf her. The explorer stayed just a step behind, shielding his eyes from the glare while his thoughts raced. Every instinct told him to pull her back, to stop her from going any further, but he knew better. This wasn't just about saving a region or containing energy. This was her moment, a testament to everything her people had lost and what they might yet reclaim. As she began to channel the energy, the ground beneath them trembled. The orb seemed alive in her hands, pulsating in sync with the unstable energy fields around them. Waves of force rippled through the air, and the explorer struggled to stay upright. Then, as if the storm itself had taken offense, a deafening roar shattered the air, and the ground split open in front of them, revealing a jagged crevasse that glowed with the same eerie light as the orb. Something stirred within it, a presence that sent a chill down his. The female's expression tightened, her focus unwavering as she pressed forward. But the explorer saw something else in her eyes now, something she hadn't anticipated. The presence in the crevasse wasn't just raw energy. It was sentient, aware, and it had been awakened by their actions. He called out to her, his voice nearly drowned by the cacophony, but she didn't look back. Her hands glowed brighter as she poured her focus into the orb, trying to stabilize the energy. It was working, albeit slowly, but the presence in the crevasse wasn't willing to be subdued. Without warning, a tendril of light shot out from the crevasse, wrapping around her wrist. She flinched, but didn't break her concentration. The explorer rushed to her side, unsure of what to do but unwilling to stand by. Another tendril lashed out, this time striking the ground between them, forcing him back. The presence wasn't just sentient, it was angry. He could feel its fury in the vibrations underfoot, in the air that seemed to crackle with intent. It wasn't merely reacting to them, it was retaliating. The female's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. She told him to stay back, her tone leaving no room for argument. But as she spoke, the orb in her hands dimmed for a split second, and the tendrils tightened their grip. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that whatever this presence was, it wasn't just lashing out, it was trying to reclaim the orb. The artifact wasn't just a fragment of the Dravani's power, it was a piece of this being, and it wanted it back. Desperation clawed at the explorer's thoughts. If the presence succeeded, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the Dravani, but for humanity and any other species within reach of its power. He looked around, searching for something, anything that might help. That's when he noticed it. The ground near the crevasse was littered with faintly glowing fragments, smaller shards of the same energy-infused material as the orb. They must have been dislodged during the instability, scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror. An idea took root in his mind, reckless, but the only chance they had. He darted toward the shards, ignoring the female's warning shout. The moment his hands touched the nearest fragment, a jolt of energy surged through him, leaving his skin tingling and his vision swimming. But he didn't let go. He grabbed another shard, then another, cradling them carefully as he made his way back toward her. When he reached her side, the tendrils of light had multiplied, wrapping around her arms and shoulders like chains. The orb flickered, its glow uneven, and he could see the strain etched across her face. He shouted her name, thrusting the shards toward her. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and fear. Then understanding dawned, and she reached for the shards, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the orb. The effect was immediate. The orb flared brighter than ever, its light consuming the tendrils in an instant. But the presence wasn't done. The crevasse roared again, and the ground shook violently, as if the planet itself was protesting their interference. The female turned to him, her voice urgent as she told him to leave, to get back to safety. But he shook his head, refusing to abandon her. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. And then it happened. The crevasse erupted, a column of light shooting into the sky. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. The energy around them coalesced, taking shape, forming something neither of them could have predicted. The presence wasn't just a force. It was a being, ancient and immense, its form shifting and translucent, like a living constellation. It loomed above them, its gaze, or what felt like its gaze, fixed on the orb in her hands. The female stepped forward, her posture defiant despite the towering entity before her. She spoke in a language the explorer didn't understand, her words flowing like a melody but carrying the weight of authority. The being paused, its form flickering as if considering her words. But the tension in the air didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper, the energy around them vibrating with barely contained fury. And then the twist came. The being wasn't alone. From the shadows of the crevasse, smaller forms began to emerge, each one radiating the same energy, but with distinct shapes and movements. They were fragments of the larger entity, echoes of its power, and they were multiplying. The explorer's stomach sank. This wasn't just about stabilizing the region anymore. They had awakened something far greater than either of them had anticipated, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The female turned to him, her expression a mixture of determination and regret. She told him that the orb had done more than awaken the presence it had called to it. The being and its fragments were part of a force that had been dormant for centuries, and now that it was awake, it wouldn't stop until it reclaimed what was lost. The explorer understood the implication immediately. This wasn't just about them anymore. The entire galaxy was at stake. And as the first of the smaller forms lunged toward them, he realized that their fight was only just beginning. The smaller forms surged forward, their movements erratic but undeniably purposeful. The explorer instinctively stepped in front of the Dravani female, his body tense as he prepared for what felt like an inevitable clash. But she placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her touch both grounding and reassuring. This wasn't a fight that could be won through brute force. She looked at him with a quiet determination that spoke volumes. This was a battle of wills, of understanding, and of sacrifice. The orb in her hands began to glow brighter, pulsating in time with the energy coursing through the air. The ancient being above them shifted, its fragmented forms hovering in tense anticipation. The female raised the orb high, her voice ringing out in the melodic language of her people. The sound resonated like a song carried on the wind, cutting through the chaos with an almost hypnotic clarity. The smaller forms paused mid-lunge, their fragmented shapes trembling as if caught in an unseen current. The explorer watched in awe as the orb's light seemed to reach out, connecting with the smaller fragments. The tendrils of energy that had bound her earlier now flowed outward, linking the shards in an intricate web of light. It was a dance of creation and destruction, a balance that teetered on the edge of chaos. He realized with a sinking feeling what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to stabilize the energy, she was offering herself as the bridge, the anchor that could bring the fragmented being back into harmony. He shouted her name, his voice cracking with desperation. She turned to him briefly, her eyes soft but resolute. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it all in her expression, the acceptance, the hope, and the weight of her decision. She was willing to risk everything, not just for her people, but for the fragile connection they had built with humanity. It wasn't just about containing the energy or preventing a disaster. It was about proving that understanding and unity could overcome even the most ancient of fears. The ancient being let out a low, resonant hum, its towering form leaning closer as if drawn by her song. The smaller fragments began to merge, their chaotic shapes smoothing into more cohesive forms. The orb pulsed, one last time, its light reaching a blinding crescendo before shattering into countless specks of energy. The fragments swirled around her, drawn into the web she had created, and for a moment it seemed like the plan had worked. But then came the twist. The being didn't just reabsorb its fragments, it began to change. Its translucent form solidified, taking on a more defined shape, one that mirrored the Dravani female standing before it. It wasn't just a force of energy. It was a reflection of her people, a remnant of their past, and it was learning from her. The explorer realized that the being wasn't an enemy but a mirror, amplifying what it encountered. Her courage, her resolve, and even her fear, all of it was feeding into the entity, shaping it into something new. The being extended an arm, its glowing hand reaching toward her. For a moment, the tension was unbearable. The explorer held his breath, his mind racing with possibilities. But when their hands met, the energy around them stilled. The storm of light and sound that had threatened to consume them faded into a gentle hum, the once unstable region now bathed in a calm, radiant glow. The being tilted its head, as if studying her, then turned its gaze to the explorer. He felt a wave of warmth wash over him, a sense of understanding that transcended words. The being wasn't just reconnecting with its fragments, it was learning from them. And in doing so, it was learning from her, from him, and from the tenuous bond they had forged across species and centuries of misunderstanding. As the glow around the being dimmed, it began to retreat, sinking back into the crevasse from which it had emerged. The smaller fragments followed, their light fading until the chamber was left in near darkness. The Dravani female swayed on her feet, the strain of the ordeal finally catching up to her. The explorer rushed forward, catching her before she could collapse. She looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips, and whispered words that he would never forget. "It's not about power. It's about..." The aftermath was both solemn and hopeful. The delegation returned to the palace, the weight of what they had experienced hanging heavy in the air. The Dravani Council, though initially shaken, began to understand the significance of what had transpired. The ancient myths that had defined their fear of the females were now seen in a new light, not as warnings, but as lessons. The Dravani female became a symbol of reconciliation, her actions proving that vulnerability and strength could coexist. For the explorer, the experience was life-changing. He had come to Viren expecting to uncover secrets about an alien race, but he had found something far greater, a shared humanity that transcended biology. The connection he had forged with her wasn't just a bridge between their species. It was a reminder that the universe, vast and mysterious as it was, thrived on connections. In the days that followed, the humans and Dravani began working together to explore the energy fields, no longer as adversaries but as partners. The region that had once been a source of fear became a beacon of hope, a place where two species had faced the unknown and emerged stronger for it. And while the explorer knew there were still challenges ahead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they had proven that even the deepest divides could be bridged, and that sometimes it took the courage of one person daring to get close to spark a change that could ripple across the stars. The aftermath of the encounter rippled through Viren and far beyond, spreading across Dravani and human societies like a quiet storm. What had once been a planet isolated by fear and mistrust was now becoming a focal point of hope and curiosity. The explorer stayed for several weeks, though every day brought new challenges. The Dravani Council, now reluctantly open to dialogue, had begun the painstaking work of dismantling centuries of rigid traditions. There were debates, long and often heated, about the meaning of what had happened in the energy fields. Was it an anomaly, or did it mark the beginning of a profound shift in their understanding of themselves? The Dravani female found herself at the center of it all, thrust into a position she had neither sought nor prepared for. Her decision to face the entity, to act as the bridge, had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical. The glow in her eyes, a lingering trace of the encounter, became a symbol to her people, a reminder of their ancient connection to the energy fields and a challenge to confront the truths they had buried. But with that symbol came a burden. She was no longer just one voice among many. She had become a beacon, and that weight grew heavier with each passing day. The explorer stood by her side as much as he could, offering a steady presence amid the chaos. He had expected to leave after the initial debriefing, to return to Earth with reports and stories of what had happened. But every time he prepared to depart, something held him back. It wasn't just the unfinished work or the lingering questions about the entity. It was her, the bond they had formed, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them through shared danger and discovery. She had risked everything, and in doing so, she had shown him a side of humanity he hadn't fully appreciated, the courage to connect, even when the cost was unknown. As weeks turned into months, the two of them became unlikely partners in the unfolding dialogue between their species. Together, they navigated the minefield of politics, culture, and deeply ingrained fears. The Dravani council members were cautious, wary of moving too quickly and upsetting the fragile balance within their society. Humans, for their part, were eager but often clumsy, their curiosity sometimes mistaken for arrogance. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience and trust qualities that were in short supply on both sides. One of the first major breakthroughs came when the explorer proposed a joint expedition into the energy fields. The suggestion was met with immediate resistance from the Dravani elders, who still viewed the fields as sacred and dangerous. But the female supported the idea, arguing that understanding the fields was essential not just for their people, but for the broader alliance they were trying to build. After much debate, the council agreed, on the condition that the expedition would be led by Dravani scientists with limited human involvement. The expedition was a turning point. For the first time, humans and Dravani worked side by side, sharing knowledge and resources to unravel the mysteries of the energy fields. The entity's presence lingered not as a threat, but as a reminder of what had been achieved. Fields, it turned out, were more than just a source of power. They were a living system, a network that connected the planet's history, culture, and biology in ways that defied traditional understanding. The orb had. Through their research, the team discovered that the energy fields were tied to the Dravani's evolution, influencing everything from their physiology to their culture. The myths that had shaped their fear of the females were rooted in real phenomena, distorted over time into superstition and taboo. The explorer marveled at the complexity of it all, the way science and story intertwine. For the Dravani, it was a bittersweet revelation, an affirmation of their heritage, but also a reminder of how much they had lost by turning away from their past. Amid the scientific breakthroughs, personal stories began to emerge. Dravani females, who had lived in the shadows of their society, found their voices inspired by the females' actions. They spoke of the isolation they had endured, the longing for connection, and the hope that things might finally change. For the explorer, these stories were a reminder of why he had come to Viren in the first place. It wasn't just about discovery. It was about connection, about finding common ground in the vastness of the universe. Not everything was smooth, of course. There were setbacks, moments of tension and misunderstanding that threatened to undo the progress they had made. Some humans saw the alliance as a threat, fearing that the Dravani's advanced knowledge of the energy fields could be weaponized. On Viren, traditionalists clung to the old ways, their fear of change manifesting in protests and acts of defiance. But each time the alliance faltered, there were moments that pulled it back together, a shared discovery, a gesture of goodwill, or simply the quiet determination of individuals who refused to give up. The explorer and the Dravani female became symbols of this resilience. Their partnership, forged in crisis, became a beacon for both species, a reminder that connection was possible even in the face of profound differences. But as their roles grew more public, their relationship also became more complicated. The bond they shared, once private and unspoken, was now under constant scrutiny. They found themselves navigating not just the challenges of diplomacy, but also the weight of expectations, both from others and from each other. In the end, it was the quiet moments that sustained them. The long hours spent poring over data, the walks through Viren's alien landscapes, the shared silences that needed no explanation. They were partners, not just in the work, but in the journey of understanding of the fields, of each other, and of what it meant to be part of something greater than themselves. As the months turned into a year, the alliance between humans and Dravani began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. The energy fields, once a source of fear, became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even the most daunting mysteries could be approached with courage and curiosity. On the day the explorer finally prepared to leave Viren, the female stood with him at the shuttle port. The sky above them was a brilliant shade of violet, the air humming with the faint energy that had become so familiar. They didn't say much. There wasn't a need. When the time came, she placed a hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his with a depth of feeling that words could never capture. He nodded, understanding all that was unspoken. As the shuttle rose into the sky, he looked back one last time, the image of her standing against the backdrop of the energy fields etched into his memory. He didn't know what the future held for Viren, for humanity, or for their fragile alliance. But he knew one thing for certain: they had taken the first step. And sometimes, the first step was all it took to change